you both know this was your sliding doors moment. You could have been in the opposite jobs had this gone just slightly differently.
This is the lamest excuse.
And he said, it's too late, it's decided.
So when did you decide, I'm going to take on the role of the Queen and the Prime Minister and announce Britain's general election plans?
Not quite the Queen or the Prime Minister.
It was just complete carnage.
You know, he basically lies.
I had no more than about 400 or 500 different calls from Andy Coulson.
You rang me about 2:30 or 3 and said, Ed,
Yes.
you've got to call Gordon. They're changing their minds. He's not calling the election. And I said, what? I'd been taking photos all day. I said, what?
Welcome to episode 3 of Inside the Room, the election that never happened.
In our last 2 episodes, we've heard the speculation build and build over whether Gordon Brown would call that early election. Now it is time for him to decide.
Now, Deborah Mattinson, who was Gordon Brown's chief pollster at the time, returns to the studio. She's with us here. Thanks very much for being with us, Deborah, to continue this journey. But we also welcome a special guest in the second half of the show.
Yes, that is, of course, Andrew Marr, the man Gordon Brown gave the big no-go scoop to himself. I think I'm right in saying that Andrew is the first journalist we'll actually have had inside the room.
Yeah, that's right. We've only had the here today, gone tomorrow politicians rather than those journalists who are with us throughout all these different political careers. And it's going to be so interesting to hear how things played out from his side of the room, his side of the camera, when he was preparing for that interview and, of course, in the immediate aftermath.
Well, look, without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Deborah Mattinson. Deborah, it is good to have you still with us.
Good to be here.
Over the last 2 episodes, we've talked through Gordon Brown succeeding Tony Blair's Labour leader, by extension Prime Minister of the UK in the summer of 2007. His first few months in the jobs, terror attacks, foot and mouth disease, the Northern Rock collapse, but he largely came through that in decent shape.
Yeah, and then came the party conferences in late September, which we were talking about in our previous episode, and the Labour conference goes incredibly well, but there's tons of speculation about an early election. Labour are way ahead in the polls. Then we have the Tory conference, my inheritance tax announcement, David Cameron's speech without notes, and the polling has shifted. So we are now on the Friday after the Tory conference.
Speculation is mounting in Britain that the leader of the ruling Labour Party, Gordon Brown, is on the verge of calling an early general election.
The question on the minds of many people in the UK is, will Gordon Brown go to the polls this fall?
Mr. Brown can't afford to see his majority trimmed. For an early election to be worthwhile, he must win it and win it well.
This election is very special because the question isn't just when, it's whether or if. He doesn't actually have to have an election. And if he calls one, he's only going to gain 2 years of being in power.
Given that the aim is not simply to win, but to win well, I think one has to say to him that your chances of achieving that are perhaps not much better than evens.
If I were advising him, I would say that he has to wait, simply because the timings, the fact that we're in the conference season, means that he cannot rely upon the polls, particularly those done mid-conference season.
He may calculate that this is his best chance to maximise Labour's polling advantage and demoralise the Conservatives.
Some experts are saying it's the state of the UK's economy that will help Brown make that very decision.
If he waits too long, his image as the wizard of economy might be damaged.
What's your date forecast?
I think it's now odds on there'll be an election this autumn.
1st or 8th of November as well, I think.
I shall see you there.
It's his call to make, and Gordon Brown will spend the weekend in deep thought before finally allowing his closest advisers a glimpse of his innermost thoughts on the timing of the next big ballot.
Well done, Gordon. It's been a very busy and a very successful first 100 days. I'm sure after all the hard work you deserve a holiday, but I fear you may have to wait till Christmas.
Ooh, I think that last voice was our very own Ed Balls being a little bit sycophantic there.
I'm not totally sure where I said that or why. I've no idea.
What was the occasion?
I have no idea. I'm going to find out what
so
that,
odd.
What is that?
It was a bit creepy crawly, wasn't it?
Oh, God knows what that was about. No idea.
Anyway, it feels like you're adding to the speculation in that clip. So, come on, we are on the Friday after the Tory conference. Where is the Labour High Command at this point on calling a general election?
I think you have to actually wind back a bit. On that Friday morning, there is a vital meeting, which Deborah is at with Spencer Livermore, Bob Shrum, Ed Miliband, Douglas Alexander. Gordon is there, kind of in and out. It actually happens, I think, in Alistair Campbell's old room.
It does.
At the front of
It does,
Downing
the one
Street.
with the circular windows.
This is the key moment, but I'm not there. On that
Ed,
Friday,
why not?
Because, as far as I was aware, we were about to have a general election, and I was a candidate, and I had arranged a whole series of meetings, of photo opportunities in my constituency for that Friday.
This is the lamest excuse.
No.
It's not an excuse. Sorry, I believe you. But
it's the opposite of an excuse. If you are a candidate and you've got to get your literature ready, you basically need to have your photo with the GP, the nurse, the head teacher.
Yes,
I
He was doing a series of...
I had booked a photographer. I drive around with 5 different neckties, because you change your tie in each one so you don't look the same, to take my photos. That Friday morning, I'd spoken...
If anyone thinks this is mad, this is exactly what I used to do as well, yeah? But you still might conclude it's
I
mad.
was in Yorkshire on that Friday morning. Gordon rang me at 6:30 in the morning and said, I'm having a meeting with the pollsters this morning. I said, I'm actually in the constituency having my photos done. I said, we are going for this now, are we? And he said, yes. He said, we're going for the election. So I then went up to do my photos. That was the Friday at the end of the week, the end of the Tory party conference week. But the first key meeting of that week had actually been on the Sunday at Chequers.
Almost a week earlier.
Almost a week earlier, where Gordon had gathered everybody to discuss whether we were going for this election. And Douglas was talking about the leaflets which we would need and the mailings and the Unite Trade Union. There was a debate about it, though. I actually said, I'll play devil's advocate. Here's why this is not a good idea. But I didn't persuade myself, let alone anybody else. The mood around the table was that we were going for it. But there was a kind of a really interesting thing which had come into the conversation, which Deborah talked about in our last episode, which was that people were saying, well, if we win the election, but with a reduced majority and lose key colleagues, is this a problem for us? Would this be a blow for Gordon? Martin Kettle, the Guardian columnist, had written a column saying that Gordon Brown doesn't need an early election, that he should be carrying on with the Blair mandate from 2005. And if he loses seats, this would be a terrible blow for Labour and for him. And so it's starting to get into this mindset, well, is it risky to call an election and lose seats? The symbolic person was Jackie Smith, who was the Home Secretary, but in a marginal seat. If we lost Jackie Smith, is that a price worth paying? I'm thinking by this point, this is too late. We're going for this now.
The speculation is
too far. Douglas Alexander, I think, was saying the same thing. I think Ed Miliband was there. So we started the week. But then what happened?
Can I just ask a question? Does anyone at that meeting say, if we don't go ahead with it now, it's going to be hugely damaging to the Brown premiership?
Damien McBride says, if we don't go ahead with this now, the media will destroy us. But others say that isn't a good reason for making the decision.
I mean, I wasn't there, but I'm certain Spencer Livermore would have said that too. I think
on the Sunday.
Yes, that he...
Because that's actually one
was very clear about what the strategic...
That was absolutely my view.
Yeah.
But what then happens, Deborah, as the week unfolds, you said you were doing focus groups every day, but also there is this detailed marginal seat polling being done. And as the results emerge, this starts to sow doubts.
Day by day, we can see it ebbing away.
Right. And it's sowing doubts in Gordon's mind, in your mind,
what are you doing?
Spencer's mind.
Are you sending a kind of daily report to Gordon then?
So we're sending a daily report. I'm calling people after each night. I mean, back in the day, we did focus groups. We do them on Zoom calls now. Yeah. But we did them, we were in the room. So we were driving to wherever, marginal seats, Harlow or wherever it was, and doing the focus group. And then, I'd be kind of like hitting the phone on the way back, giving a kind of top line
And would
debrief.
Gordon, some political leaders I've worked with, they want to know every single detail, what everyone in the focus group says. Sometimes they actually go to the focus groups and stay behind
which Gordon did do sometimes, and he did want to know the detail.
And he was obsessed with the detail, as many political leaders are. Some political leaders aren't at all. They kind of leave that. That's for the polling experts. But
no,
he was all over the numbers.
He was keen to know. I think everybody was keen to know.
How was your mood changing?
I remained of the view that we should go. That it was the right thing to do, that it was probably the best chance. Back to this sort of analysis of leaders in the job and how that 3-month pitch was the best.
People who take over as Prime Minister without a general election.
Transitional, yeah. To my mind, although things were looking less good, and it was a pity that the Tories had this very good week, I felt that we should go.
So I've spoken to Gordon at 6:30 a.m. Friday morning from my constituency who says we're going for it. You then arrive in Downing Street for what was like a rolling meeting. How did that meeting evolve over that day?
Well, the meeting was really weird. Actually, I'd gone first to Stan Greenberg's flat in London, where Stan was the American pollster that we were using to do the numbers, and it worked quite well in this instance where we're turning stuff around fast because he's got his team in the US. They turned it all around overnight. We're dropping it into a presentation, and it's not good. It definitely shows how well the Tories have done that week, and that we're taking a hit.
Although still a majority.
We didn't have MRP and things like that back in those days.
We should say those are the new polls that do seat by seat.
It's an analysis so that you can take a large opinion poll and then you can look at what it means for each constituency. So we didn't have that, but we'd grouped the polling in different areas, and it showed the same. It told the same story basically that it had told, at the meeting in our conference, but it was now a bit worse because the Tories had a really good week. And qualitatively, that was starting to cut through.
And
people were noticing that.
And who was saying what in the room? Was Gordon there the whole time?
So no, he wasn't. Gordon was very, very, very grumpy. So Gordon was coming in and out with papers and seeing bits of the presentation.
Who was chairing the meeting?
Nobody was chairing the meeting. There was nobody was in charge of the meeting.
You're up in Yorkshire getting your photo taken.
And I remember speaking to you on the phone, actually, after the meeting had basically finished.
You rang me about 2:30 or 3 and said, Ed, you've got to call Gordon. They're changing their minds. He's not calling the election. And I said, what? I'd been taking photos all day. I said, what? He said, and Deborah said, they've changed their minds. The polling's not good. They've changed their minds.
But who's the they?
So no decision was taken. By the way, no, Spencer
Damien
was still
McBride.
very much of my view and your view, I think, that we should go ahead. Bob Shrum was quite decisive. So Bob Shrum, at some point, I think Gordon said, what do you think, Shrum? And Bob Shrum said, I was speaking to Teddy Kennedy just yesterday, and he said what I could do with 3 years in government.
I love the arrival of the Kennedys. That's unexpected.
He literally said that.
And in Damien Rye's book, it says, at that point, Gordon looked at Bob Shrum and walked out of the room.
Well, he was walking in and out of the room the whole time.
But I think, but in a portentous way. I think the reality was,
Do you think we all get a bit starry-eyed with these American commentators, by the way?
That's a whole separate podcast, isn't it?
I think the reality was that while Spencer and Deborah were of a view, the others were getting really worried. I think that Sarah Brown was very worried about Gordon becoming Prime Minister and then losing the job very quickly. Yeah. Bob, I think, would have been talking to Sarah. Gordon was clearly worrying about that too. And I spoke to Gordon from the constituency, said, what is going on? And he said, we're not going for it. He said to me, they've all changed their minds. And I thought, well, but Gordon, I spoke to you this morning, and he said, the polling, it's difficult. They're all changing their advice. And I said, and he said, it's too late. It's decided. I said, well, can we talk further? And he said, I need you to come down because we've got to sort out how we're going to announce this. But it's done. And I just thought.
Well, I certainly didn't know that. I mean, there was no, as I say, nobody was chairing the meeting. And there wasn't actually a moment where anybody said, what do you all think? Or,
Is that because no one wanted to take the decision for him? Ultimately it's Gordon Brown's decision. And it sounds to
it
me
is
like
his decision. I think that is, of course.
I think he was deciding without
head was
wanting
on the block, nobody
without
else's.
wanting to say he wanted to decide.
Yeah.
And so it went from, to me, at 6:30, to 3, it's too late. And you rang me, I think, because you were
Well,
worried.
I thought if anybody could persuade Gordon, it would be Ed.
But
I did think that.
Must be
you were the one person he would listen to. Of all of us, you were the person he would listen to.
That I was not there, but I thought it was done. I genuinely thought we'd decided.
Yeah.
I was having the photos taken.
Yeah.
Can you believe it?
Did you use the photos in the election a couple of years later?
No, I'd aged.
You'd got different ties by then.
Yeah.
But there must have been a moment when Gordon says it's not happening. I mean, how would he have communicated his own decision to the group or to whoever?
Well, I guess that
You're both living-
conversation with
No,
you.
no,
I mean,
but-
I certainly
well,
didn't. I mean,
He
basically,
said this
I
to me
went
on the
in.
phone, but
we did this
But you had rung me
presentation-
because you were worried.
Yeah,
So
well,
had
at
there
that
been a
point, I
moment where-
didn't know. I didn't know there was no decisions as far as the meeting had sort of evaporated.
Right.
So one minute, San and I, we've got a projector and we're projecting onto the wall. There wasn't a screen or anything. I mean, it was all, and people were coming in and out, and the meeting just evaporated.
I don't know whether he had a conversation which was the deciding moment, and I don't know who that was with. It sounds like it wasn't in that room, but it wasn't with me, because when I spoke to him, it was decided.
It had been decided.
It was decided.
Well,
And,
all I know, I felt like I was waiting and waiting, and it actually wasn't until the following day, and I'm texting Spencer and saying, what's happening?
But
and
you
I
and Spencer had
eventually-
not changed your minds.
No.
And has Stan Greenberg changed his mind? Was Stan always slightly more sceptical?
Stan was a bit more sceptical.
Had Bob changed his mind?
Well, Bob had said what would we
sounds
do
to
with
me,
3
I mean,
years? That
Bob
sounds
was a
that's
champion
pretty.
a month before.
I mean, I feel like I'm the sort of therapist here. But the helping
How about
the
Edmund
family understand how the decision was made.
How about Ed Miliband and Douglas? What did you get the feeling from them in the room that day that they were changing their minds?
Nobody said we must go for it or we must not go for it.
Is that because no one
Actually-
wanted to preempt?
And I think this is
Gordon?
back to your point that actually, in the end, ultimately, it was one man's decision.
And when you look back on that day now, how do you feel talking about it?
I still think if we had gone, we would have won.
So do I.
I'm very clear about that. And I think what happened next, everything would have been very different.
Majority would have been
The whole-
lower than 68.
We would have lost a few seats, probably. But we would have won.
We always felt
And-
that we could, that at that time, David Cameron and George Osborne were still not established. They were not established within the Conservative Party. They still looked young. Gordon was solid. We thought an election campaign would work to our advantage rather than against us.
Yeah.
That's how we still felt,
Yeah.
rightly or wrongly. That was our mood.
Well, and I think it's still right, notwithstanding your great week, actually, as you've said, George, you weren't ready.
No, I mean, jumping ahead, since our overwhelming feeling was one of relief when the election was cancelled, I guess that reveals the fact that we
exactly.
were...
You weren't ready. You actually weren't saying bring
whereas
it on.
in 2010, I was really excited about the election.
Yeah.
So we were definitely not... We were,
Yeah.
By the way, I mean, there's not much to tell about the Conservatives on that day, that Friday. We're sitting back in Parliament. Normally at the end of your conference, you'll go home and you're absolutely shattered. I remember being exhausted. But we had gone back into the offices in Parliament and we'd started to do all the things you have to do for a general election, like start to organise an election grid of where the leader's going to go, the leaders. I mean, none of this had been organised. We had to think about rapid appointments of candidates because lots of seats didn't have candidates. I mean, the one question, it's always been said that Labour had already spent I think there's talk of like several £1 million on booking billboards, which we were picking up. That was further confirmation that the election was on. Because
Peter Watt said it was over £1 million. I mean, Douglas had talked about that at the beginning of the week in the Chequers meeting, that the money from Unite, but also from party money as well. I mean, we were definitely we were gearing up. We were going for it. The party thought we were organising an election, so it was genuinely stopped on that Friday rather than. It wasn't that it wasn't starting.
It was in train.
It was stopped.
Well, I mean, that's crucial because we're going to come on and talk about what Gordon Brown says about cancelling the or not having an election. Because I think, this is what, without getting ahead of the conversation, the fact that Labour, as you say, had committed money to the election campaign is crucial. I think in Gordon Brown's own explanation of what happened.
And you worked really closely with Spencer Livermore, probably more than anybody else. Gordon's kind of political polling person on the inside with you. What was Spencer's verdict and your verdict at the end of that Friday into that Saturday?
So So I'm chasing what's happened, because at that point, as far as I was aware, there was no decision. I didn't know. I guess I still thought we were going ahead, but I didn't know. And eventually I got a text message back from Spencer. It was just 2 words, and it said, complete carnage.
And the reality was, very unfairly, Gordon was very blaming of Spencer. Spencer really took it in the neck, and and it was
Why?
It was very unfair.
Well, I mean, but
because
no.
I think in the end,
why was it?
Because I think Gordon felt somehow he hadn't been. I mean, how could this have happened? And who is in charge of the polling? I mean, Spencer didn't stay very long after that in Downing Street. It was totally unfair. But I think
wasn't the leader
I think
of
Spencer
the
got the blame.
Wasn't the leader of the Labour Party potentially responsible for all of this?
I'm just saying.
So Spencer got the blame for what, though? I'm not sure what he's being blamed for.
For it all going wrong.
The speculation and then the cancelling of the election.
Wow.
Don't you think that's the case?
I don't know. I mean,
he did, and it was not fair.
Yeah.
Because it was not Spencer's fault at all. It wasn't your fault.
Yeah.
You
I
guys were
certainly felt
providing
there
the
were
information.
people. I felt that Gordon felt seen. My relationship with him was never the same after that. And although I carried on working with him for a while, I didn't, There were lots of relationships which were never the same. Yeah, it was never the same. I felt
searing days.
There were people that he sort of couldn't look me in the eye anymore.
Yes. Deborah, before we finish, are there any sort of general lessons? If you were an active politician today, what do you think are the kind of lessons from this whole period? I mean, from becoming the new Prime Minister to the speculation about an early election. I mean, what would be your advice? We don't, Keir Starmer's got elected at a general election from opposition. He's got a huge majority, so it doesn't apply to him. But, whoever Keir Starmer's replacement is if there's a Labour Prime Minister who comes after him in government.
So I think reflecting on it, I think two things. For myself, and you were saying, how did I feel? Thinking, I regret, I think I could and should have said more to defend the position of going for the early election. I think I could have done. I think I should have done, perhaps, to sort of counter the, hey, here's what Teddy Kennedy would have given for those. Yeah, I think I could have done that. I mean, in terms of the lessons for politicians, I think it is about having setting out your stall in a very clear way. And I think that's particularly important for a transitional Prime Minister coming in. And it goes back to what we talked about in previous episodes, where we were talking about, that summer and being father of the nation and events. And actually, I think that he needed to have had a stronger sense of what he wanted to do.
We are going to let you escape our studio now, but thank you so much for sharing your insights. Thank you very much indeed for being inside the room with us. And it's been, as we said at the beginning, been quite triggering.
Very.
I mean, I don't know you. This is the first long conversation we've had, and all I've been thinking is, God, I wish I'd had your advice over the years. I was active in politics because everything you've been saying, I felt, God, this person really knows what they're talking about. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Deborah.
Absolute pleasure.
So we've been hearing all about the build-up, the speculation, is he going to do it, the Friday sort of decision in Downing Street not to go ahead. And then an interview is arranged on Saturday in Downing Street with probably the most prestigious doyen journalist of British politics of the time, Andrew Marr. But then things go all a bit wild.
James, thank you very much indeed. Andrew Marr is just being rigged up live on air. This is all obviously evolving before our eyes.
I think we can now speak to you, Andrew.
The first thing to say is to be absolutely clear there is not going to be an election this year.
I believe the public, their priority was not an election, but that we got on with the job. But having made the decision, I made it for the reasons I'm saying.
Your advisers were suggesting you went.
And there were people who were saying that you should go, there were people who were saying you shouldn't go.
You've marched people up to the top of the hill, and now you're marching them back down again.
Too big a risk, too great a gamble. You have to remember, just to put it into context, this is a man who's waited so long to be Prime Minister.
And it's quite clear now he's had to make a humiliating retreat because it's the Conservative Party that's winning the arguments in Britain today.
You must be relieved there isn't going to be an election.
I think I was entirely convinced there was going to be an election, were you?
Gordon Brown's fight back begins with a press conference here in Downing Street, meeting political journalists, some of whom aren't too pleased at the suggestion being made that the talk of an election was all a media confection.
Can you say, hand on heart, the change in the opinion polls was not the trigger for your change of heart over the election?
Yes, I can, because I've told you the basis on which I made my decisions.
Surely you change your mind
because you thought you might lose. Why can't you just admit that?
George Osborne, the Shadow Chancellor, said that if you didn't call an election, you'd bottled it. And that is a phrase that will be heard up and down the country today.
7 brown bottles sitting on a wall, and if one brown bottle should accidentally fall, there'll be 6 brown bottles.
It's almost, with you, a trial run for what he's going to face in the House next week, and he is not going to be given an easy ride.
The House has noticed the Prime Minister's remarkable transformation in the last few weeks from Stalin to Mr. Bean.
He's the first Prime Minister in history to flunk an election because he thought he was going to win it.
We are joined by Andrew Marr in the studio. We're novices to this broadcasting game, so to have the king of it in our humble court is great for us.
All I was going to say is that I am joined by two rather ashen-faced men, because you both know this was your sliding doors moment. You could have been in the opposite jobs had this gone just slightly differently.
Yes, I'm a bit less ashen-faced as a result, because it worked out to my favour, but not at the time that I knew that. What before we get to this crucial interview you do with Gordon Brown on the Saturday after the Tory conference, you know, obviously you had already done conference interviews and you had been talking to people in the Conservative Party, but more importantly in the Labour government. Where was your sense of the decision-making on having this election?
I had left the Labour conference pretty much clear that there was going to be an election. That sense had been building all the way through Bournemouth. I was going to interview Gordon at the end of that conference, but as any political journalist would, I had been talking to political advisors and aides and MPs all the way too. And indeed, according to my diary, I had...
you keep a diary?
I keep a diary. According to my diary, Jackie, my wife, and I had dinner in the Royal Exeter Hotel with Ed Balls and Yvette Cooper to discuss this very matter, I think on the Friday. And you were very clear, Ed, that there should be an election, there was going to be an election. And that was my sense from people like Douglas Alexander, Ed Miliband, and many more that I've been talking to.
And any sense of what, I mean, the Conservatives, we'd had a good week at the conference, but what was, did you think we were up for it, or we were like rabbits in the headline?
You're being very modest. You had a very good week because you had made your move on inheritance tax, and there's no doubt that did have a spooking effect on the Labour Party. They weren't quite sure how to respond to it.
So when you had the call to you and to your editor, Barney Jones, that Gordon Brown wanted to do an interview for the Sunday Marr programme, but to pre-record it on the Saturday, I guess you were called Friday night. Did you know when that call came through that this was the interview to announce the general election or to announce there wasn't going to be a general election?
I am as big-headed and grandiose as any journalist, but I didn't think a Prime Minister who was going to announce a general election campaign would do it just on my show. In other words, had it been to announce there is going to be an election, there would have been a big press conference, roll of drums, lots of hoopla, and therefore I was pretty clear as soon as I got the call that he was not going to announce the election.
And as I understand it, Gordon had a breakfast arranged for the Sunday at Chequers with Rupert Murdoch, and therefore he couldn't do the interview live. And
let's get our priorities right.
I know, and they want. I mean, it's a very unusual thing, isn't it, to pre-record a Marr interview?
It is a very unusual thing. It's not an unusual thing to be big-footed by Rupert Murdoch. I think anybody in journalism would expect that to happen. Nonetheless, I don't like pre-recording interviews. Never did. Certainly big ones, and I certainly don't like going to Downing Street. I've had to do it a few times. I did it with David Cameron. I did it again with Gordon Brown later on. But I don't like doing that because you're on their territory. You're on their turf.
But this was non-negotiable.
This was non-negotiable.
This is the deal.
And there was only one discussion in British politics at the time. Is there now about to be a general election or not? And therefore it was clear that not only could he not avoid the question, he did not want to avoid the question. Ergo, he was going to call it off.
Now, we've also, in preparation for this show, I was talking to Andy Coulson, who I was working very closely with at the time, who was our Director of Communications. And this is his recollection of this crucial 24-hour period.
Saturday morning, I remember I was stood at the side of a football pitch watching my son play when I got a call from a journalist who told me that Number 10 had arranged for an interview with Andrew Marr to announce his decision. So I told anyone who'd listened that this was going to happen. that Andrew was getting the exclusive, that they should get down to Downing Street, start firing in phone calls, cause as much chaos as possible. So Andrew, who is no fool, worked out for himself pretty quickly that this was a story that he was going to lose control of if he wasn't careful. And so he left that interview in Number 10, marched straight across the street to a camera and got himself on live television. And the game was up. Brown bottled it. And Gordon really was now in an impossible position. How do you explain why you're calling off an election you told everyone you thought you'd win? That national interest brand that he built for himself was damaged. And Gordon was now in a position of being a sort of ditherer driven by self-interest. But it was our job. I saw it as our job to make sure that wasn't a sort of temporary characterization, that we really nailed it, and that was an idea that would properly cut through. So David did his clip, and we'd also managed to somehow or the other purloin a set of sort of fancy dress bottle suits, change the Newcastle Brown logo to Bottle of Brown, 0 strength. Some bright spark even rewrote the words to 10 green bottles to 10 brown bottles. All very childish, you might say, except those pictures of the pictures of those suits and the TV footage of it provided the media with some great live images for broadcast and print the following day. The start of fixing that idea of Gordon as a bottler, and it also got under the skin of our opposition. It was a great demonstration of that esprit de corps that I mentioned. We might not have been ready for an election, but we weren't ready to give up either. And if we were going down, we would go down with a smile on our faces.
Goodness me. So you actually announced the decision for Gordon Brown?
I did, yes. It was absolutely obvious that I wasn't going to be able to walk out of Downing Street saying nothing, and that was going to last for...
Because you were supposed to go in the back door, weren't you?
I did go in the back door. And, I'm not normally a petty man, but I did enjoy, I have to confess, standing inside Downing Street in that big room, waiting for Gordon to come in and do the interview, and looking down into Downing Street. And thanks to Andy Coulson, there was Adam Bolton of Sky News storming up and down, kind of glaring up at me and more or less waving his fist. And I thought, gotcha. I was very pleased by that.
So you did the press conference?
I, as it were, did the press
conference.
But
hold on, before we get to the press conference, can I just ask, you'd obviously interviewed Gordon many times.
I had, yes.
How was he in that interview?
He was completely relaxed and affable and fine. It was as if he didn't quite realise the scale of what he was saying.
I mean, I'd been in Downing Street that day from 9 until he did the interview.
You'd come back from Yorkshire.
I'd come down that night from Yorkshire because we were all summoned back. It was the worst 5 hours in Downing Street I ever experienced. It was terrible. His mood was dark. He was angry. The media kind of handling was just impossible. To pull off being kind of relaxed. I mean, in bonhomie with you, it's astonishing because that was not his mood before.
And I have had some ups and downs with Gordon Brown in the past. It hasn't always been bonhomie between us, but it certainly was that day. I think there was a sense of relief. Finally, I'm going to take the decision out of my own hands. I'm going to put it out there. And it's going to be, it's beyond control. So there may have been an element of kind of human relief in it by then.
And do you think, so you obviously had the story which was nominally embargoed for your show the next morning, but you had these other rival journalists outside. So when did you decide, I'm going to take on the role of the Queen and the Prime Minister and announce Britain's general election plans?
Not quite the Queen or the Prime Minister. But, you were talking to Andy Coulson just now. I suppose in the couple of hours before the interview, I had no more than about 400 or 500 different calls from Andy Coulson. I mean, it was perfectly clear. My mobile phone was more or less dripping through my fingers. It was so hot. And given that, it was absolutely obvious the story was not going to hold. And because the BBC had got the scoop, I was absolutely determined the BBC would hold on to it. What was not going to happen is for me to do the interview, Adam to get a call from somebody, and Sky to announce what had happened before we did. So
we know. I mean, it was always the plan, wasn't it, that you were going to put it out that evening. So it was always going to. It wasn't going to wait until the next morning. We now know what happened, which was that all the Sunday papers are gearing up on that Saturday to write their massive coverage, and they all think there's going to be an election. So they're gearing up to do pages on the election challenge, the election choice. The Sunday papers are so important in British politics. And the judgment made in Downing Street by Damien McBride was that if the Sundays didn't find out the election was off until 7 at night, the anger and the backlash would have been so terrible that to keep good relations, you had to call a few trusted people and just tip them off so that they wouldn't be embarrassed. And as he now says, that was a disaster. But he says, what else was he supposed to do? Because you couldn't have the Sunday papers humiliated by Andrew Marr on the BBC on Saturday evening at 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening.
Absolutely. But in the same way, what else could I do but go out and announce it as soon as possible?
Were there people in presumably the media team in Downing Street were saying, oh, hold on, Mr. Marr, that's not at all what we've agreed?
I don't think we discussed it with the media team in Downing Street, as I recall.
The media team in Downing Street by that point had their heads in their hands and were being yelled at by Douglas Alexander for causing this terrible media debacle. Although, of course, the media debacle...
To be fair, he was probably being yelled at by someone else.
Almost certainly. The media debacle wasn't the timing of the Andrew Marr interview. The media debacle was getting to Friday night, Saturday morning with massive expectations we were calling an election and then thinking you could get away with doing totally the opposite.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I have a lot of sympathy with Gordon Brown in this situation, really. He'd only just become Prime Minister, really, after waiting for so long. He'd had a very, very good first few months. There were the first signs of something really big happening in the markets, but none of us knew about it. And, to go into an election and be Prime Minister for only a few months would have been awful and intolerable. I completely understand why he quotes bottled it quotes.
But he'd allowed that massive head of steam to build.
He certainly had. And that had really happened at the Bournemouth conference, beyond everything else, I think. So many people were talking about it during that week. And a week of a really intense, every conference is an intense, roiling, boiling political atmosphere. And that was what it was all about all week.
On the Friday, which ended with his people calling you, Barney Jones, to say the interview is being done with you to not call the election. That day had started at 6:30 a.m. with him calling me. I was in Yorkshire having my election photos done to tell me we were on.
You were on Friday morning and you were off by Saturday morning.
We were exactly. What a sliding doors moment that day was. The line in his interview with you where he says, I didn't look at the polls.
Well, indeed. And he was asked that again and again and again to chortles and head shaking every time he was asked about it. But the polls must have had something to do with it.
Of course they did.
A lot to do with it. I don't think it was only the polls. I think he could see where George was going in terms of tax policy, and he could see that was going to be a problem. At that stage, we thought that the Northern Rock was going to be an even bigger story. I can see he could see some little cracks in the Dyke wall, as it were.
But those would be all reasons potentially to go. Catch the Tories before they're fully developed with their policies and their election plans, get ahead of any impending problems in the economy. I mean, there's a lot of speculation, and I can't prove this, that Rupert Murdoch himself phoned Gordon on the Friday to give him the results of the News of the World poll that showed, that he was at risk of losing his majority or getting it at least being reduced to sort of wafer thin.
I am not persuaded of this story. I mean, look, it may have been that Gordon was wrong by Rupert
Well, particularly
Murdoch.
if Rupert Murdoch's having breakfast with him on the
next
Sunday.
morning. Yeah.
But we know that Andy Coulson says in his clip to us that he didn't find out until later about the News of the World poll, and all our polling was strong that we were going to win a majority. Also, the other thing was that there'd been a falling out.
It was on the slide, though. We heard from Deborah.
A little bit. There'd also been a falling out at the end of the Labour Party conference. If you remember, the Times led on Gordon Brown's speech being plagiarised by using that line from Kerry. And Gordon was very upset about that and had spoken to Rupert Murdoch and to Robert Thompson, the editor, and things. And in a way, I think that the Murdoch breakfast on the Sunday was about putting things back together again. I'm not sure that Gordon and Rupert Murdoch were, on the closest terms on that Thursday and Friday. But who knows? It may have been what happened.
Do you think? I mean, you've done all these interviews over your long career with all the British prime ministers, with Barack Obama, Vladimir Putin. Where does the interview with Gordon Brown on that Saturday sit?
In terms of domestic stories and immediate impact right at the top, I mean, I've had fantastic interviews. I had a wonderful interview with Putin, wonderful interview, as you say, with Barack Obama, and many, many more. But in terms of instant punch, that was a very big, clear story that had a huge impact. And I knew it was going to, and I knew that while I was doing it. And the minute it had finished, I just thought, wow.
Did you foresee then, as the first person who, outside the Brown inner circle, who received this news, did you foresee what a catastrophe it would be for the Brown premiership? I mean, that famous Vince Cable question in Parliament, which we had in the medley earlier, of going from Stalin to Mr. Bean. I mean, it absolutely shattered the Brown image, didn't it?
I have to be honest and say I don't think I foresaw any of that, really. Like none of us foresaw the massive financial crash that was just about to happen. We didn't understand it. I don't think Gordon Brown understood it. The British government, nobody understood what was about to happen. No, nobody understood how the financial markets at that point worked.
But before the crash gets really underway in 2008, he has a terrible. We're turning a bit to sort of after these events, but he has a terrible autumn after cancelling the election.
The loss of the child benefit discs, you remember?
The discs are lost with all the child benefit information on them. Alistair Darling tries to copy some of my announcements at the Tory conference. I think Gordon Brown never really recovers from cancellation. And I do also think it's not just the speculation and the bottling. I do think there's something in his explanation to you in that interview and in the press conference. He basically lies. He says he's not looking at the opinion polls when everyone knows, A, there's no Prime Minister in Britain in British history who wouldn't look at the opinion polls, and B, that Gordon's all over the detail. That's, by the way, his great strength.
A kind of instant smirk comes onto the nation's face at that point.
And that's
There's something really interesting in politics, that you can go from almost complete invulnerability, where everybody trusts you, everybody looks to you, to the opposite within a matter of seconds.
But I get the feeling that you're saying on the Friday night into Saturday morning, you were rather sympathetic to his decision not to go ahead with the election.
I could understand it, I must say. We'd all been following the extraordinary Blair-Brown soap opera for years and years and years and years. We knew how desperate he was for the job. And at the time, people are going to look back at Tony Blair now, but at that time, the Blair era seemed quite tired. People had experienced Blair for a very, very long time. And there was a feeling of start again and freshness and a new start when Gordon came in. That went away very, very quickly, partly as a result of the events we're discussing today. But I could understand that having finally got the prize in his hands, putting it onto the table in an atmosphere of risk was something very.
But
very
I think is the difference that Gordon Brown had established from Tony Blair was precisely that he was a straight talker. Blair at that point had a reputation for quotes lying over Iraq, and he had, and there was a kind of question about his moral seriousness, and Gordon Brown had all those things, and so therefore to sort of allow this speculation to arise over the election to be obviously very partisan and sort of party political, and then to basically not tell the truth about the reason why you were cancelling it. I think that was shattering.
Yeah, but he was caught out in a sense by his own decision. I mean, that sort of granitic, highly moral son of the manse business, which was absolutely is also real. He's a complicated man, Gordon Brown. We can all agree about that. And he is a man of enormous moral seriousness. But I think on that particular narrow political point, he was suddenly caught.
I also look. George really does not like Gordon Brown, but that is kind of
Well, he doesn't. He started it.
Okay, well, that's.
I respect him.
Can I say that's a slightly childish retort, but that's fine.
It was meant to
and
be.
when you use the word lie, that is a very serious allegation. I actually think there is a different way of looking at this, which is that I don't think at any point from beginning of September or back to July until that morning, I ever had a conversation with Gordon where he said, I want to do this. Mm-hmm. I think he was always sceptical in September. I don't think he went to the Labour Party conference thinking it was a good idea. In some ways, for the reasons Andrew says, I took the view that he was losing control of the agenda and we really had no choice. We had to go for it by the time we got to the end of the Labour Party conference. Gordon was never the kind of person who felt he lost control of the agenda. And in that week, when the polling comes back being more cautious, Gordon in his mind, he doesn't think the polling is changing my mind, which makes, in your words, him a liar. Gordon thinks, look, I never thought this was a good idea.
I was always waiting and watching.
I think he returns to his fundamental view, which is I don't think this is the right time to have an election. So I don't think actually it's the polling which changes his mind. He has said to me on the Friday morning we're going for it, but actually in his core that wasn't what he wanted.
I think I agree. Maybe I don't mean lie in the kind of barefaced way, but the idea that at 6:30 on a Friday morning he tells you we're going for it, and then 24 hours later when he's not going for it and he tells Andrew, I didn't look at the polling. I mean, that's just not true.
Well,
that's just not true.
I understand that, but I think what happened.
And you're saying, well, he didn't. No. In his core, he hadn't made the decision, but he told you he was going for it.
I think what happens then is that his team around him on that day, not me because I'm not there, all start to suddenly show doubt, and he thinks, well, if they're not clear, why can't I just return to what I've always thought? And he ends up defaulting back to his underlying. By the way, I'm not excusing him. It was a total screw up, which had a terrible impact on his reputation. And he, as Bob Shumthorpe said, he had the 3 years during which he did some big things, but he never quite recovered from it. That is true. All I'm saying is that it's emotionally complex what is going on with him in those days.
But we're all of us sitting around this attractively banana-coloured table, and none of us know what would have happened. We can't be sure it was the wrong decision he took. David Cameron and George Osborne might have won the 2007 election.
Yeah, I think Labour would have won a majority.
You think they would, but you don't. Nobody knows.
What do you think would have happened?
I think it would have been very, very close indeed. I think you were on the slide a bit in terms of the polling.
Northern Rock,
and I think
right
Northern Rock had
slowly.
People had begun to worry about the banking system just beginning. You don't know what would have happened actually during a general election campaign in terms of the financial news. I think it would have been really nip and tuck, and you might well have lost.
What was true was it caused an atmosphere of acrimony within the Brown Downing Street, the Brown team, which never really recovered. The Sunday newspapers were terrible. Everybody was accusing everybody else. What I think we now know is that people who weren't even in those meetings back to 2006 and the Tom Watson plot decided to get their revenge and were kind of saying lots of things about Douglas Alexander and Ed Miliband, which were then blamed on me and others, which wasn't true. Yes. But it became very acrimonious and very nasty.
I mean, within a couple of weeks, there are other events, the Alistair Darling mini budget, the loss of these child benefit discs, but a settled view emerges by November that the Brown premiership is sunk. I mean, the polling is horrendous, and by the summer, so 6 months later, you have James Purnell plotting, you have the 10p tax fiasco, you have David Miliband on the... if we fast forward to the next Labour conference, that's the one where David Miliband is challenging for the leadership. So it is the moment that Brown never recovers from. He might have been able to recover from it, and there's certainly a moment in the G20 he organises where he has a kind of chance of coming back. But I think, speaking from the opposition's point of view back then, I think from that autumn onwards, we thought, we're going to be the next government.
He certainly lost momentum very, very badly. But I think politics changes so fast, you can never say that is the moment it all went wrong. There is this other world in which you'd have been dealing with Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers and all the rest of it, and that meltdown. And I think, during those months where we had the summit in London and so forth, there was a general feeling that Gordon Brown and Alistair Darling had handled that very well. Things began to recover, not enough, but, you can never tell. And I think I completely understand that at a human level, you've just become Prime Minister, you think you've got a lot to do, you think you can change the country in a good way, and you look at the numbers, are you going to go back to the roulette table and have another fling? Probably not.
What is true, though, isn't it, that he had become Labour leader without a contest. There wasn't a general election which gave him, as Prime Minister, that mandate. And therefore... aside from the knock to his reputation, which I think is real about the handling of the interview with you, the reality is that when you go into a very tough 2007 into 2008, when the economy is in huge crisis, but also where politics starts to fracture, Gordon is weaker in dealing with that as a unifying figure within the government than he would have been if he had a mandate from a leadership election or a mandate from a general election if he'd won.
But if he had had a much reduced majority, and we had Deborah Mattinson in here saying that all the forecasts were there'd be a big reduction in the majority that Blair had,
60 to 40. That's still. I mean, the campaign was much smaller at the time. This is all pre-Corbyn.
She said 60 to 40 before the Tory conference, right? And then, and I would, remember the mood at the time might have been like Gordon Brown can't, he's taken the Blair majority, he's lost a lot of that, right? He, by the way, him and his acolytes, not you, but others, pushed Blair out, and which was, the feeling at the time. He didn't even have an internal leadership. I mean, his own leadership of the Labour Party might well have struggled to survive a big loss of Labour seats, even if they had just won the election.
Although his leadership of the Labour Party goes through that whole period until 2010, despite the best efforts of James Bennell, maybe David Miliband, and certainly Jeff Hoon and Patricia Hewitt, he still clings on in that period. So
great clunking fist.
He was certainly resilient. It's as you say, part of the game, because it is only a speculation, is what would have happened. But it's also the case. Part of the reason we do these conversations is to also think about what lessons you draw for current politics and future leaders. And when you look back on this time, what lessons do you draw from that, which you would point to for contemporary politics?
If you dither, and everybody dithers, never let your dithering get out.
Right, we're not going to dither. That's a very good moment to end what has been a really interesting, terrific run through 3 great months of British politics, where the twists and turns happen and the momentum.
Great months.
Well, great. I think to Andrew's point, it just is. I think the biggest lesson to politicians is you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Politics changes all the time, and you go from Brown's incredible start to his premiership. He's on the cusp of winning this election. There's the sort of Tory fight back, the dithering, the disastrous decision interview, then revealed in the interview, and it's just a lesson of events in politics are totally unpredictable. And
you always think you know what's round the corner, and you're always wrong.
Yeah.
That brings us to the end of this edition of Inside the Room. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, George.